All right. We are back yet again. This one, I don't know, Beth, is this an emergency pod in a way? I mean, I know we were thinking of other topics, but we
A
also knew
breaking
that
news pod.
we knew this was coming down. We just didn't know
Yeah.
exactly when. I don't think we were
Yeah.
either of us were watching the entire thing with a microscope, because we have some other guests coming soon to discuss this very topic. But I know that you and I, going back to, the 90s when the internet kind of hit the world of publishing and hit hard in the world of advertising. And I think you succinctly said, we both represent the buy and the sell side almost
Mhm.
perfectly in this conversation. So I think it's important to talk about the verdict, which came down, and
What
I don't want
verdict,
to mess
Craig?
the name up. Judge Brinkema.
Judge Brinkema.
Okay, so we got Judge Brinkema's decision. We've both gone through it. I'm not going to tell you that I read the entire decision. I'm very much like Eisenhower from our last episode, where I haven't read the entire thing. I'm never going to. No, but I will. I will go through it. I've done that before. So we're gonna but we're gonna talk in broad strokes here. Maybe get a little detail, but I wanted to get your first impression of what's it's kind of being talked about as a loss for Google, but actually it's a split decision. Obviously,
Mhm.
there'll be an appeal, but
Mhm.
let's start there.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Judge Brinkema. I think one of the first things I want to say is I found her so impressive throughout this entire process. And, I was the one of the nerdy ones that were following this day by day
Yeah.
as it was happening. Um, she is 80 years old. I
Yeah.
gotta tell you, when I'm 80 years old, I'm not learning this kind of new stuff. Forget about it. So I just found her ability to really dig in to, quite honestly, and we'll talk about them, but, quite honestly, there's elements of this lawsuit that I get lost in. I'm like, how are you connecting these dots? So I think big kudos to her for A, being a lifelong learner,
Right.
but B, really, I think being thoughtful about the case and the decision. Like you said, it did not go 100% to the DOJ. There were elements of that broke down.
Yeah.
I think the problem is the core elements held,
Right.
where the plaintiffs didn't win were more, in my opinion, tertiary pieces of the case, which is still beneficial to Google. But that core piece of, do you run a monopoly over the ad tech ecosystem? Um, they lost on
So
yesterday.
I like to throw a lot of stones. Right. So to me, this is a lot of stones going back to my side of the business. Right. The sell side. We had the inventory, we had the quote unquote content, right? And I think there's a lot of stuff that went on there that was a mess, right? And
Mhm.
and leading up to the acquisitions, which I wrote down, they begin in 2008 with the acquisition of DoubleClick.
Mhm.
You have Invite Media being purchased in 2010, and then finishing off the coup de grace is AdMeld in 2011, right? and
Mhm.
and all of a sudden you have end-to-end stack. So here's my first bone to pick. So many, and I think here's the part that's strange, because I know I don't often side with Google, but in this case I sided with Google in the sense of, I don't know why we were relying on ad tech competitors to come in and testify against Google, who I think
Mhm.
should have
Mhm.
had to come in to testify against Google, were the people that were my bosses, right? Were the
Mm.
were the
Mhm.
people on the publishing side, on the content side, on the video side. And at that point, there was no such thing as video. Keep in mind, we're still
Mhm.
ahead of YouTube and Daily Motion and all that stuff. So we're talking about if you remember, I know a lot of the listeners don't, but you couldn't even run a video on a device, right? We were amazed
Right.
when we saw like a GIF image, right? We were, oh, I
Right.
can't believe. But But obviously this accelerated rapidly, and Google had positioned themselves by 2013 to kind of control the end to end. And
Mhm.
here's my bone to pick, which is the ad tech side of this takes too much of the margin. It
Mhm.
pushes the content, the curated content, which we've talked about with Simon, right?
Mhm.
Pushes the limits to which things can be actually vetted, read, edited, because it's, this is not just a writer and then you just go ahead and blog what you want, right?
Right.
And then we end up on your side of the court where it's, I've got advertising and I want to know, where my advertising is going. I need to be in front of the right people at the right time. And let's face it, I mean, Google by 2013 corners the market, right? I mean, there's no other way to put it. They had
Yeah.
monopolized the market by landing ad serving technology, basically saying, well, you can go to other places, but you're not getting our inventory, right? You're not going to get access to the fill. It's really things like fill percentage. It's not even the price so much as it was fill percentage and things like that the other exchanges, ad networks, whomever you're talking about from your end, the advertisers couldn't make it up.
Yeah, the take rate. Well,
Yeah.
and that's where I'm going to be really interested in the remedy. Um, and this is where I get a lot of haters on LinkedIn when I post about this. Is I'm not sure that breaking this apart is in the best interest of the industry. And there's a lot of great language in that ruling when we come back and talk about this again. There's a lot of great background in this ruling about what the laws around monopolies are, what they're intended to do.
Yeah.
Um, uh, to a certain extent, Google created a better mousetrap, and they did that through acquisition. And you know, Meta's facing the same thing right now, which I don't generally tend to side with Zuck. But how can you go to Meta today and say you shouldn't have bought Instagram 15 years ago? Okay, maybe they shouldn't have, but you let them. So what I'm interested in terms of the remedy is I think the DOJ did a great job of proving the monopoly, and that's, the judge is very clear in her ruling what legal precedent she relied on to rule on that. I think it's really hard to argue that they don't have a monopoly. So I'm a little bit more supportive of Google than you are historically, but I think that case is clear. Um, where I think what I would like to see folks talk a little bit more about is um, what did they do with that end to end? So for me, the monopolistic practices come in the context of all those things that you're talking about. They could operate double click for publishers in a much more competitive friendly way than they did.
For
And I think
sure.
I did take a note on this because it really stuck out to me when I was reading the ruling. I actually it was a reference in the ruling, and then I went into the court documents to find the uh, uh, evidence, the
Yeah.
actual memo. And it was a memo from Neil Mohan, who at the time was the senior vice president for display and video ads, to Nikesh Vora, I think is his name. He was the president of sales and global sales operations and biz dev. And this was back, I think, in 2009, if I recall correctly. And in the memo, Neil says, um, that the glue that seals the double click for publishers with the Google Content Network is AdX. Like they knew what they were doing, and then they
Yeah.
manipulated it so that, to your point, it didn't benefit the publishers. So, long way around to say, I somewhat question whether breaking it apart completely is the right remedy, but certainly requiring that competition is, and I'm sure many people will argue that the only way to ensure the competition is to break it apart.
Yeah, I mean that's again, I'm not a student of what happened with Microsoft or AT&T, right? We're hopefully gonna have somebody who is and is gonna kind of
Mhm,
explain this to us, and give us a primer on that. But what my experience in this, having not only worked for the publishers and then myself becoming an owner of a network before the DSP, before the SSP kind of became the nomenclature. We were a network product, and
mhm,
seeing how we couldn't compete. Right, there
mhm,
was a just level of, we got to stay away from Google. We got to try to figure out a way to work around the edges. And there was this kind
mhm,
of just general malaise. And we were a small business. We had, I think at the height of 495, we were 27 people. You
mhm.
can imagine, but see, the thing that was wild was I would go to industry events and I would talk to really big companies, ones like with names like Yahoo and other
Mm.
big brands, and they were like, "Yeah, we're all fighting for that next percentage that Google doesn't take."
Yeah,
And that was where it was very clear that something was wrong, right? And when you have that, when you and if you read the testimony and know this process, and those guys, and the particularly the Google employees kind of saying like, "Hey, we want more of
yeah,
the pie, like
yeah,
more of the pie. You're at 85% of the pie now, 90% of the pie now. Like we're trying to compare working with a publisher to what they're doing with YouTube, right? Where again they own the end to end conversation, and that won't change, right?
right.
So these are tough. And then when you throw in obviously the simultaneous case with search,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And we've already talked about Gmail. They have this kind of perfect triangle of, hey, we're gonna dominate the business cycle, and that was what really hurt. And we'll pop it in the section below, but I'll share a website where it shows all the companies that Google just purchased and killed. One of which I want to do a podcast about and discuss, because I was in on it. I was like,
mm.
oh wow, this is an amazing technology that could have really helped the business that I was working on, and they got bought by Google and were gone, never to be seen again.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a really important part of the case too. I want to, and I'll come back to that, but I want to go back to that 90% rev
Yeah.
share
Okay.
on the DFP side. Um, when they bought DoubleClick, um, you mentioned Yahoo, you mentioned Microsoft.
Yeah.
I think there was a third potential. I'm not, maybe Amazon. Um,
Or AO. I think
Look,
at the time it was like
oh, it
AOL.
might have been AOL. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right. Um, let's look back historically on that. Is what we're saying is Google should never have been allowed to buy DoubleClick? And if that's what we're saying, then does that mean DoubleClick should not have been allowed to sell? Because if Google didn't buy them, then Yahoo or AOL
I
or
think,
Microsoft
yeah,
might
and I
have
and
bought
I think,
them,
yeah.
and then they would have had the competitive advantage.
So
So the
yeah, and
90% didn't come purely from the purchase of DoubleClick. The 90% advantage came from the manipulation of,
of everything.
First Looked, Project Pro, and then I'll come back to your last point being, buying these companies and just killing them. And good for the owners who sold them and walked away with the money. But you're right. To me, that's where the greatest stifling came in was, their willingness to just gobble them up and spit them out.
Yeah, this is like the magnates of transportation
Hmm.
at the turn of the century, right? It's like,
Hmm.
hey, I'm dominating I'm the Vanderbilt, I'm dominating the water, I'm going to do the rails, I'm going to do whatever it takes to move people. And look, I mean, the three acquisitions that are constantly pointed to, of course, start with DoubleClick, and I don't think that there's no coincidence in the timing of each of those purchases,
Hmm.
right? So, and I hate to use this expression, but maybe they were playing chess, and the Department of Justice, who's ever looking at it, are playing checkers, and they're like, well, what are we gonna say? We don't want to stop. No, nobody wants to stop innovation,
Well, they
right?
also didn't understand the business.
And I
And
still,
that's why
and
I
as
give such credit to Judge Brinkema. The
right,
FTC just didn't understand the business, and they didn't bother to. But go ahead.
a lot of people don't understand the business. There are people who are in the business like me who don't always understand the business, right? Try to
Yeah.
figure out how to. I remember unwrapping a tag and like all this stuff that was going on our network side. I can only imagine the machinations of running DoubleClick, right? Where you've got
Hmm.
divergent websites and publishers. You're popping it in. You're landing a new ad server. But that's really the beginning of it. But see, to me, it happened earlier. To me, it was these big publishing companies and content creators, whether it's broadcast television, who had a longer leash, right? And you and
Hmm.
and you can see that big brands are surviving and battling it out with Google, like a Comcast and Netflix, these brands, right? But the
Hmm.
but the publishing business, right, had it, and I think that the mistake was there. The mistake was right there for them to give up the ad serving, right? For them
Mm.
to, so it was me. It was the my boss's boss and the
Mm.
and the people in the back end, the technology that they didn't invest and think, oh, we were so blinded by the fact that there's no way that you're going to want to give up your newspaper or your magazine or your television show on Thursday night at 9 o'clock that you're always going to watch. That is what really hurt. And when by the time, look, I mean, it was even before 2008, before the acquisition of DoubleClick, that they were already in trouble, right? We were
Hmm.
already looking at it.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then, it accelerated from there. I mean, I remember by 2013, 2014, right? It was Google or nothing.
Yeah. That's a really interesting perspective because, so for me on the demand side, I remember when all of these things were evolving, the acquisitions were happening, the new products were being rolled out, and we were applauding it. This was giving us an opportunity to get access to more inventory, to be smarter about our targeting, all of that. And I think, that's one of the things that you and I are trying to do with this podcast and these conversations is, kind of break down and educate people on how this evolved and how we got here. Um,
Well, doesn't the
go-
evolution doesn't the evolution begin at like when you were doing digital originally, you guys were sending me an insertion order,
right, right.
right? with
That
with like
became
an Excel spreadsheet that said, here's how many impressions. We were selling you a finite amount of impressions for a certain amount of money, and you guys quickly figured out, like, man, this is not going to work. It didn't work
well,
financially, right?
it was the explosion of the number of websites. So it worked
Yeah.
fine in the days of the internet because we were talking about 250,000 websites. I mean, we didn't get to over a million websites, I don't think, until like 1998. And most of those you didn't want to advertise on anyway. So in the beginning, it worked because of the lower volume. It wasn't until the explosion of I just looked up this number the other day. It wasn't until the year 2000 that we got over like 2 million websites or something. um and if you think about it, in the early days, Google did not set out to be an advertising company, an ad tech company. Google started out their mission, which I should have memorized, but to organize the world's information and make it accessible, available to all, sort of thing.
Yeah.
That really was what they started out to do.
I'm I'm
They,
I'm gonna I'm gonna throw up a roadblock on there. Like, how do you pay for it? You were giving Gmail away for
well, no,
free.
that's that, but
Yeah.
that's well, that was way before. We're talking about late 1990s.
Oh, okay. I mean, me. Yeah.
Yeah, that is what they started out to do. And yes, you're right. At some point, you've got to say, how do we make money on this?
Right.
Um, and so I would argue, and I know there's a lot of people that won't agree with me,
Yeah.
but I would argue many of their very, very early products were really created with the intent. And I say this because I was in those conversations. They weren't going to create an ad product that I wasn't going to buy. Um, the intent really was, we've got to monetize this thing. What's going to be of service to you that you're going to be willing to pay for? that I can leverage. Now, I agree with you that that quickly flipped, um, in the early aughts where it became, oh, wait, how can we just continue? It became
again,
an ad
it was,
revenue company.
I think it's the publisher's fault. I think it's the publisher saying, well, we rushed right into programmatic, not knowing that that was going to create a level of availability that turned everything that we did, all the premium
Hmm.
content. Then I remember after we had kind of given up the bit, right? We'd spit the bit, as it were, giving everybody the opportunity to buy us programmatically, and then all of a sudden we have to kind of come up with, like, well, you have to buy these special ad units. You got
Hmm.
to have a homepage takeover. You got to have a private marketplace, or we're not going to give you. So there was this kind of, so, well, let's try to defend our turf, but it was over already.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It was over. It was done. Like, I listen, I spent many a night, where I worked. I mean, it was 17, 18 titles digitally. And I looked at those
Hmm.
numbers and I just said to myself, man, can never, right? It doesn't matter. It can never make the math work where these guys were thinking like, I had a magazine that was doing X amount of dollars every month, right? There was no way to predict that in a world that was 100% programmatic. It was based on
Hmm.
demand.
Right,
If
right.
whatever super celebrity said something, everybody walked over there. So, you were out. So,
Mhm.
it was a very fast transition, even though it seems slow. You and I would say, right, like you mentioned earlier, 1996, 1997, 99, and then by 2008,
Yeah,
it's DoubleClick is gone. By 2011, they've got Ad Meld, right, and that's it. They're off to the races,
yeah,
and there's
yeah.
nobody stopped them because Yahoo gets out of Right Media, right? So
Mhm.
there's no more exchange. Then you have all these kind of, and a lot of these people were testifying, right, which kind of
Right.
was like, yeah, I know, but you were trying, you're also the culprit in a right, like the tech in
Yeah,
the middle is kind of the culprit. It's really the advertiser, it's the Campbell soup, and then the company on the other end, the magazine brand on the other end, trying to say like, well, come and do my recipe.
yeah.
Here's a great recipe for your product.
Well, Craig, I think you should get on the legal team for their appeal. I think the most stunning thing for me in the trial, and it was the first day of Google's defense, and we can try to grab it and put it in the show notes. The uh, graph or graphic, I should call it, that Google put up on day one to explain what was happening. Your kids 10 years ago could have drawn a better image than that. It,
Yeah,
it became known as the football
yeah,
chart.
yeah, I saw
And,
it.
and it was, so I was really shocked at the defense that Google put up. Because to your point, why didn't they bring some of those people in? Why didn't they try to poke some holes at how they gained control? What were people not doing? And again, I'm a little more friendly to Google than you and many other people. But again, to a certain extent, they were trying to solve real problems that we had in the industry.
You and I have had Rich on from Complex, right? And
Hmm.
here, and I would suggest, and I know that this is the truth because I worked at other publishing companies. Most of the other companies were doing next to nothing, and
Hmm.
when I mean that, I don't mean that the people that, please, I love you all. You know that I do. What I'm saying is it should have been whatever the highest DEFCON level is, right? That this was an existential threat, right? That these companies, and we see, the thing is, the part that I can't forgive is we lived through it a little bit with Yahoo
Hmm.
at the very beginning. I remember being at Meredith Corporation in the late 90s, and I remember this company Yahoo coming in and saying, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take your article, we're then going to give you a percentage of what we earn. And I think that the dollar signs lit up in the heads at that company and said, okay, here's how we're going to make millions. And it turned out to be thousands.
Yeah.
Right, like less than an
Hmm.
insertion order in Better Homes and Gardens is what they were yanking in at the end of a quarter,
Yeah.
right? And it never improved, right? And then and I think that what I thought, right, young sales guy, then I moved to Ziff Davis, and I'm like, oh, these guys are much more tied into it. Turns out they weren't either, and they were
Yeah.
selling the
Yeah.
technology,
Yeah.
and it turns into kind of just a route.
Yeah. Well, and that's also where I kind of struggle a little bit with some of the arguments being made here. Google is a publicly traded company, right? And so they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to grow the business. And that's what they were doing. Now, on the flip side, the guys that you're talking about, they were doing the same thing as well. And as you gave them all due respect,
Yeah.
they weren't asleep at the wheel because they didn't have the will, but in the early days, that isn't where the money was going to come from. So,
But I feel like
part of
I feel like what you're saying, and the wrong word is, it's like they accidentally became a monopoly. But I think what I'm really thinking is they were like, okay, you're not going to stop me in 2002. You're not going to stop me in
yeah, yeah,
2004. By the time 2008 comes around, they're just like, well, I mean, what are we going to do? We have to do this. To your
yeah.
point, if they didn't, right, then somebody else could have stepped into the void, and maybe Yahoo makes a massive comeback. But I think that, to me, the monopoly is the whole kind of alphabet pie, right? It's the search, which I'm including YouTube in because they're number one and number two, right?
Hmm.
The Gmail, which is what, 70% of the items. So I saw some number the other day that we're going to talk about in the future. Like, they got the inboxes, right? And then they have this ad business. And I think that it's very difficult for anybody to say that they are not an end-to-end monopolist in that regard. What the remedy is, I don't know what this remedy is. The search remedy is pretty clear, right? It's like, well, we
Hmm.
got to they got to get out of Chrome. I find that hard to believe, but that's what that what's the remedy
Well, that
here?
that should be another podcast because
Right.
I
No,
don't
no, I
agree
understand.
with that either.
But what I'm saying is, what's the remedy here? Yank, double click out.
Well,
Ye-
and that's kind of what I was saying early on
Yeah,
is yes, at face value, you look at, hey, they own the end to end, that's a monopoly. That's a pretty quick and simple conclusion to come to. But to your point, I don't think that that in and of itself is necessarily, I should rephrase that. I don't think that in and of itself has to be the problem. I think where it went from building a better mousetrap to just out and out greed is when you get into the first look, when you get
yeah,
into that glue that melded, the
yeah.
DFP to the ADX, and then making very purposeful, which the plaintiffs did a great job of getting the words from the horse's mouths, these very purposeful decisions of manipulating the marketplace.
That's look. That's the tough. That, that's it. I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't need to go further than that. But the manipulation obviously created the environment. But what I'm saying is that was after. To me, the beginning is really earlier. It's much earlier than even the purchase of DoubleClick, because there's. You're right. They're a public company, and they have to they have to try to make money, and they're in the ad business to support, right, this gigantic machine. And because again, I think that if you force them to sell DoubleClick, DFP, the ad serving side of this, the problem with that is you need a company that's going to innovate that particular product.
Who's buying this? That's where my head starts to explode. Is, oh, make them sell that. Okay, great. Who's going to buy it? Who's ever going to buy it is going to do the same thing with it that Google did. Why would Apple buy it and I mean, either way, whether they do the same thing as Google, they're bad in terms of leveraging it, or if they do the same thing as Google in terms of killing it, they're bad. So
Yeah.
who's going to buy it, and what do you want them to do with it? That doesn't make any sense to me.
So the remedy to me, right, or at least, this is where we go back in our, now we're leveraging history, right? It's like, look at the New York subway system, right? Most people don't
Mhm.
realize those are all competitive businesses
Mhm.
underground for a long, long time, right? And
Mhm.
then it's all kind of tied
Good old
together.
IRT.
Right. The two big IRT lines, and then you got the Broadway line, you have different gauges. You can even see it. You
Mhm.
go down
Yeah.
below and you can see different gauges. And that's a train system.
Yeah.
And that was tough to blend together. We're talking
Yeah.
about millions of sites and apps,
Mhm.
millions, not a million, millions.
Mhm.
And the power of this is the power of this discussion is it has to innovate constantly to meet the demands of customers. And
Mhm.
to your point, I don't know who else is capable of innovating it other than some gigantic big five, right? And even I'm not even sure the bottom of that big five can do it anymore. Perhaps really
Mhm.
only the top three. So if we're looking at Google, we're looking at Amazon, Microsoft. I mean, Apple has never been really a kind of a in concert to the ad business, right? I've never thought of Apple as the ultimate advertising vehicle machine. So who's doing it? The
Yeah.
government? We're going to turn this over to some government program, or can it be completely independent? To your point, make money. I Be very difficult for me to understand, because every decent ad server that I've ever known, and I was in the video space where DoubleClick wasn't,
Mhm.
right? Remember that. And every one of those products, including your buddy Zuck, right?
Mhm.
Every decent one got purchased.
Mhm.
What does
Yep.
that tell us? So
Exactly.
right there, we could bring on somebody like a Joe Hirsch, right? We could bring on different people to say, yeah, because we knew we had this technology and we got purchased. That's the only way these things live on. To your point, they got to be connected to something that makes money.
Right.
That's the problem.
Right.
Does
Right.
ad serving survive on its own? Do you take, like, is this Social Security where we take 2 or 3 pennies out of every ad serve and put it into the pot, and somebody, I don't know. I don't know how it works, but it's absolutely a
Is
great
there
question.
an NFL model here? I don't know.
Well, the other way to do this, right? The other remedy here, and I'm sure we'll bring some people on to talk about it before the remedy comes out. But you know, do they have to open it up, like complete? Like, how do you open it completely up?
Well, and I don't know if that's exactly what you're referencing, but I think the other piece that I want to get to at a later date is another part of the decision references this idea where and this was part of Google's defense, you can't dictate who someone is going to work with. And that's what Musk is trying to do with X right now. And I think that's another big existential question we have as an industry is, how is that? How do we think about that in the future? And I think the remedy for this will have really strong implications on those kind of decisions.
Well, listen, my friend, it's Friday afternoon. This has been enlightening, but as you know, this is a topic that you and I probably will be talking about until they pull the plug on us. Um, I have to say, like, I don't know. I'm going to think about it. Obviously, we're going to bring on. This is going to be a very immediate thing. We're going to have a couple of guests come on. Perhaps we'll even we'll have to bring Rich back again. Maybe have another conversation specific to this and get some opinions. I'd love to see where this goes, because the remedy in my mind is, is there a way to open it up to make it more fair, to make it, transparent? See, that's the issue, is transparency with Google
Yeah,
is the problem. And
that's
when you
right.
don't have transparency, then the competition can't be real. It's like,
Right.
yeah, I'm
Right.
playing baseball with a metal bat and you're playing baseball with a wooden bat, but you don't know
Yeah.
that, right? And that's the problem. So I think we leave it there. We come back, we bring a couple of guests, and then we duke it out again. We talk about this as a topic. I think this is fascinating, but again, I'm not I'm thinking like, wow, it hurts your head to think about how you break this side of the business up
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
make it work for everybody. Because I
I
do think
agree.
innovation is crucial.
I agree. Yeah. Can't quash innovation.
Cannot do it. All right, my friend.
All right. Great to
Enjoy
see
your
you.
weekend.
You too.
Talk with you soon. I'll end.
Bye.
We'll stop here and come back to more Google.
Absolutely.